It is a great privilege to host three upright, seemingly tireless, but certainly courageous men who keep the torch of truth burning day after day and offer guidance to the many who are desperate and looking for a direction after almost all of humanity has lost its way. Today is March the 26th, 2021. We are Stefan Lanka, Andrew Kaufmann, and Tom Cowan, and Dean Browse. This is Freedom Talk 2, and we're planning to continue these conversations and eventually combine the contents into a written form, maybe even into a book. Starting today, we want with a quote by the ancient philosopher Lao Tse, who said, "Nothing on earth is so weak and yielding as water, but for breaking down the firm and strong, it has no equal." Stefan, would you like to start this time?
Oh, I hoped I would be in the middle or at the end, because everybody knows now this is my topic, water and the surface tension membrane, you know. So I'm not going first deep into philosophy, but afterwards very deep insight, because what happened in history, what is the conclusion out of this, is that everything is originating out of water, not directly out of water, but membrane. So this membrane builds up everything, our own tissues, but all elements, and can take it with and can dissolve it again, you know. So this is what I'm seeing. And now we are getting deeper, because this principles which have been known before in ancient Greeks, before Democrit, was that the principles are in a big sense, the small, like in the smallest, but all of a sudden they came up with the atom theory. And the atom theory makes it impossible for us when we swallowed it, and when it, you know, focused our mind, you know, then we cannot see the principle behind this sentence, right? Because we think if it's smaller and smaller, then it's suddenly completely different. It's those are atoms, you know, where we have no feeling towards them. But we cannot imagine anymore that how it's in the large scale, it's in the smallest scale, and that there is a continuum through all of it, you know. And let's, in the end, it means what happened in our society, in our history, at least 2,500 years ago, we are not able to imagine why there is a deeper and a literal sense behind this sentence, yeah, that everything comes out of water and goes back inside water. This was Thales von Milet, who said this. This is a principle. He and later, through Democrit, he said, no, we are going to have a new kind of science, and in this kind of science we have no principles from the smallest to the biggest, you know, but we are inventing a new theory of life, because in all the other theories there is consciousness, there is God, there is a spirit, and we want to have a theory of life without all of this, for a given reason, because all religions were inducing fear into the people, fear towards or in front of God, that God is punishing and so on. And that was their good intention to came up with a new theory of life and matter. And this is what I have in mind when I read this, because nobody can understand this deeper who is inside atom theory and thinks we are out of molecules which are come into existence from atoms, touching themselves, building larger molecules, eventually building life. And this is not true. it's the substance water is building on its surface, wherever it touches something else, air, a surrounding, or substances devolved in it, or in movement with itself in a vortex. And this substance does matter because all matter comes out of this substance, and there it can dissolve everything. If water moves on something like this, it's going to dissolve it definitely over time, sooner or later. And that means behind this is the old wisdom that we have a principle that the substance we are all out of, it's there in the large scale, but it goes also down in the smallest scales, being always the same. And this is the importance for me, and to demonstrate we are not able to get this deeper and for a deeper understanding when we are still in the atom theory of life, where this matter, which Aristotle told the ether, when we are not aware of it, that this is there, that it's a own substance on its own, and that we consist out of this substance, and we even breathe it in. The Indian would say this is the prana, and the Chinese philosophy called it chi. And that out of chi, everything comes into existence and everything goes back into this substance. And this is this quote from Lao Tse. For me, what's the deeper meaning? On the one side, the positive meaning, we find back to old wisdom, to a spirituality where we have in the matter every potential to materialize life. And on the other side, of course, the situations we have now, that we are not able to understand the deeper meaning of this because we lack the understanding, because we are dominated by a 2005-year-old theory of life, which is definitely wrong, the atom theory.
Wow. Thank you. Tom, I'll read it again for you, right?
So thank you. And the way I would put that, maybe it's not so related to that quote, but to me, right now, humanity is at a kind of a crossroad. And there's a lot of ways of describing this crossroad, but one of the ways is to humanity can either, and when I say humanity, I mean not just people, but all living forms, can either continue to be a water-based organism, or we can become a quartz-based organism. And there we have a kind of a choice. A quartz-based organism, interestingly, you could call an in silico organism. And we've talked a lot about that with viruses. So what I mean by that is, and this also was, this story was brought home to me. I was in the car once with a like a 4-year-old friend of mine, and we were listening to the radio, and somehow an interview with me came on the radio. And the little friend said, "Oh, Tom, how did you get inside that radio?" And I said, "Well, I didn't really." And the interesting thing about that is, of course, he thought that I somehow crawled inside the car radio, which is not the case. So the radio is the water. And what I mean by that is the radio is the water in a living organism is the receiver of information. And the reason it can do that is because water has essentially, it's a holographically organized entity which has infinite surfaces which can accept the information from the world, from the sun and the light and the moon and friends and the dogs that I just saw and the cats and the plants. And it can essentially integrate because it can accept all these influence from the outside, and then it can change its configuration. Now, in contrast to that, we have silica-based crystals, so that we're talking about a water crystal versus a silica crystal. A silica crystal can do all of those things. It has infinite number of surface areas. It can download almost infinite number of information, and it can add one bit of information to another. And the interesting thing about a silica-based crystal is it's essentially stable indefinitely, like even maybe thousands of years. So the question I asked myself is, why wouldn't it have been better if human beings and all life was made of silica instead of water? Because water, they both have this ability to accept all influences and essentially download, if you want to use that word, any influence from the universe. But there is one difference, and that is the quartz crystal can never change. It can only add more bits of information. Whereas every time a new bit of information is added to the water crystal, it has a slight change of its configuration, maybe its surface tension, maybe its ability to form new entities in it. And that's what we call growth or evolution. So if some negative thing happens to you, a challenge, a divorce, a tragedy or something, that influences your water crystal, and then you have the possibility of developing new insight out of that. In other words, you can grow. And I would contend that that is exactly what we call a human being. And a quartz crystal can never do that. It can just add more and more bits of information. It can never integrate that. It can never grow. It can never evolve. And so there is no possibility of feeling. There is no possibility of thinking. There is no possibility of integration. And there is no possibility of creating a meaning out of life. Because all it is just more and more, as Stefan said, atoms or information downloaded that have no sense of each other. And you could never integrate that into a life that is meaningful and worth living. Now, the challenge is there are very strong influences that want to integrate the human being with this silica process. They want to make us not just in silico viruses and in silico genomes, which are imaginary, living only in the computer. They somehow want a human being to be an in silico organism, living only in the computer. And that's the opposite of a living water-based organism, which is the kind of organism that I want to be.
Thank you. Nothing to add.
I think that's good. Not an in silico one.
No.
I don't like that kind of organism.
All right. Andy, it's your turn.
Well, thanks, Dean, and thanks, Stefan and Tom, for those amazing answers. And Tom, there are actually a couple of several movies that show what it would be like if we did adopt that in silico model for ourselves, and it's very disturbing.
Very, yes.
So I kind of went a different direction with Lao Tse's quotation here, because I conceptualize our current experience and the status of the world as being akin to a war or a rebellion or revolution, but I don't mean in the traditional sense of, armed soldiers clashing, but more of a spiritual and information warfare. And of course, we've seen, incredible amounts of censorship and stifling of dissenting opinions. And if one is going to approach this situation to, avoid the negative influences and try to bring about a proper solution that would fit with the true nature of our humanity, we can assume the properties of water, which are the basis of our life. Whereas we may see ourselves as individuals as being weak and yielding in the face of government tyranny, actually, the truth is that we are quite firm and strong, and I would even say powerful, if we as individuals take the right action. That will exert a major influence because we have water as the basis within us. And, famous martial arts legend Bruce Lee, who also really was a philosopher. He studied philosophy and wrote and tried to apply philosophical principles to martial arts, which really helped it rise to a much higher level. He talked about being like water, in that whereas if you fill a teapot with water, right, the water becomes the teapot. It takes on that form. And it is so adaptable. And we know that it can exert its influence to even erode massive rocks, right? And that if we have this flexibility to take on different forms, and that if we can be weak and yielding and also firm and strong at the appropriate times as water, then we will empower ourselves towards, a freer, healthier future for ourselves, and that effect will be amplified and emanated throughout, the entirety of humanity.
Let me see if I can bring this in.
This is what it is, okay? I said, empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend.
That was the one you sent to me, right?
Yeah, it gives me chills, Dean.
Yeah, me too. All right, let's transition to the next part of our panel discussion, which is the crux of the matter, which I called it, and it's the virus isolation claim. We have some recent projects of yours that I will bring in afterwards, after the discussion, and you will certainly talk about yours. Maybe, Tom, would you like to start this time? Why the virus isolation claim is the crux of the matter.
Right. So the interesting thing about this is if you just talk to just normal people, or you talk to healthcare professionals, i.e. doctors and other healthcare people, and you say, so how do we know if there's a new virus or even any virus associated with the disease? Most people give you answers, well, like if a lot of people get sick, that means it's a virus, which obviously is kind of ridiculous. But the people who have thought about it a little more and are sort of more scientific about it say, well, what we do is we take a sick person and we take some of their fluid, and then we see if they have thousands or millions of copies of this identical virus. And then once we find that, we know that that virus caused that disease. The fact of the matter is that, as far as I can tell, has never actually been done. It certainly has not been done with SARS-CoV-2. And that's shocking to people because they say, you mean you can't find a virus in the secretions or lung fluid or vesicles of or blood of a sick person? And even for me, as even being part of the HIV/AIDS thing, it was very difficult to sort of wrap my brain around, like, is that actually true? Now, the importance of that, as you said, if you can't isolate, and that just means purify so that you have these many, many copies, like thousands of copies of an identical particle, right? That's what we're looking for. Not various shaped particles, not some particles that are 10 feet tall and others that are 6 inches tall. You should find thousands of copies of the identical particle. Once that happens, and only if that happens, can you then characterize the particle and see what it's made of, see its genetic material if it has any, see what the sequence of that genetic material is, and then see if that particle actually causes disease. Now, if you haven't done that isolation, you have no idea what the particle is made of. You have no idea, if you're looking at a brew of genetic material, where that genetic material is coming from. And you have no idea what that particle can and can't do. It's my ping pong ball example. If you put a ping pong ball in a bucket of stones and ice cubes and you throw it at a wall, you will never know that the ping pong ball broke down the wall. Every human being says the only way to do that is to isolate the ping pong ball and throw only that at the wall. So since this topic came up with us, I decided to scour the medical literature in the past week to see there must be one article, one journal published article showing the isolation of a virus, a pathogenic virus from a sick person. I was determined to find it. And I found some very interesting things. Like, I found a paper called, this was from 1966, Structure and Development of Rabies Virus in Tissue Culture. So the first thing is they basically didn't isolate it from a sick person, but they isolated it, which is not isolation, from a tissue culture, which already makes the whole thing invalid. But they had a very interesting quote. They said, rabies virus particles have been studied recently under the electron microscope by various investigators who found the morphology of the virus to be variable. Working with infected brain tissue, they observed, in addition to bullet-shaped particles, long filaments, round hollow cords, and round forms resembling myxoviruses. In other words, they looked for a pig and they found pigs and chickens and horses, and they said, see, they're all pigs. Because we're looking for something that's identical, and they found all these variety of shapes. And so that's not a single virus. And so that's not isolated. I found other ones. I found a CDC report that I also am going to quote. So this was from the CDC, July 2020. And they were showing SARS-CoV-2 from various tissue cultures. And they said, and I'm quoting here, SARS-CoV-2 showed robust nucleocapsid protein in both Vero cell types, less protein in WHO 7.0 and 293 T cells, and minimal protein in A554 and EFK38 cells. In other words, they took this unpurified stuff from a so-called COVID patient and grew it on these different cell lines. And what they found then, and this is what they call isolation, what they found was when they grew it on the Vero cells, the capsule, the protein capsule, had lots of protein. And when they grew it on the HUH cell, HUH cells, it had less protein. And then when they grew it on the other cell line, it had almost no protein. And to any normal human being looking at that, you would say, that's not the same virus. The protein content came from the tissue that you grew it on, not from the virus. That's obvious. And somehow this became the definition of isolation to the CDC, to virologists. In other words, at the end of hours of looking through PubMed, I could not convince myself that there was a single example of a isolated, same morphology, same structure, same genetic material from one sick human being ever published in the medical literature. And maybe somebody knows different, but I certainly couldn't find, and I don't think it exists. And once people realize that there is no virus, you can't then say this piece of the sequence came from that virus. You can't say it causes disease. I hope this whole thing is over and we never have to deal with this again.
Yep. Nothing to add again. Stefan, would you like to continue this time?
Yeah, I think starting with Lao Tse again, if we just show what happened in virology, the information itself, or that we are transporting the information, we are the water dissolving the hard stone of virology, and not only virology, but the whole concept behind it, right? And to focus it even on a more understandable way, it's just to name what happened in history, that in 52, the old virology definitely was abandoned. And just to know, there was an old virology where virus was meant to be a toxic protein with the capability of self-reproduction, because they believed proteins are the genetic material where they store the information, how they look like, so they can self-replicate. But then in 52, it was shown no proteins need a piece of nucleic acid in order to reproduce themselves. So the old virology definitely was abandoned, but nobody knew what should the virus look like at this time, right? So somebody came, and this was John Anders, to the idea, well, let's try to replicate it. And probably when in cell cultures, in cells of animals, which we grow in the test tube, when they are dying, probably the same is going to happen like when bacteria are dying and building phages, which were considered to be the viruses of bacteriophages. And they killed the cells, not knowing, starving them, intoxifying them, and then they added, in the same time, seemingly infected material. And this act to bring something out of the laboratory, blood or something infected, seemingly infected material, and add it to those dying cells, then this act, it's called isolation, and the dying cells, they isolate because they believed, parallel to bacteria, when they are dying and building mini spores, alias bacteriophages, the same is going to happen in the test tube. And this was the self-fooling, because deeply believing there must be a virus out there responsible for the dying of the cells, that bacteria are going to die. And of course, they are responsible for those diseases which since centuries we are claiming to be caused by toxins of disease, Latin virus. So this central fact or acting in the year, in June 54, that the dying of the cells was equaled with the presence and the activity of a virus, this medical doctors and virologists are believing is the isolation. And later they were not wondering, or probably, forgot that those bacteriophages or mini spores I found out of the sea, the so-called giant viruses, or sea virioplankton, which is called nowadays, yeah, they all are easily isolated, like money out of a pocket, coins, the same coins, and characterized, but they were using from this time on molecules, proteins, and nucleic acid out of this mixture of dying cells and add them up mentally to a model of a virus, which they never saw, in blood, in salvia, in other liquid of the body or inside the body, inside tissues, inside glands, inside an organ, never ever. And this is how it comes. And I think from my point of view, to explain and to teach people and to help to understand where this concept originated out of the history. This is the water which is dissolving, the concept. This is a smooth explanation. And of course, what I'm actually doing now is to point the needle into the balloon of this theory, which becomes really big. And so I want to have it smooth. I did other things to convince people that there is another explanation. There is a theory of life which is much better without contradiction, explaining everything, how you get sick, how you get healthy, why you can stack into a healing process. And I hoped to explain it this way, smooth like the water. But now I'm forced to use the argument as a needle to bring it into the balloon, because the balloon, it's exploding our economy, it's exploding the minds and of course the bodies of the people. They are getting injected with highly toxic substances for no scientific reason. It can't possibly help. So this is what I'm now in my plan to act smooth like water, but now forced to use the isolation argument like a needle to bring it into the balloon. Because if the balloon explodes on its own, it means the economy, it's destroyed, and the Chinese government can buy us and can raise the red flag over Europe. And this is what I don't like. I mean, you Americans, you are happy because some of the states stopped and are going to survive. But here, they are planning to vaccinate the whole population several times. I mean, that's the situation why I'm unfortunately not able to act like the water, smooth with my arguments, which is there and has to be used, yeah. But on the other side, to use the argument of the isolation as a needle into the balloon of corona virology.
Thank you. Andy, you sent me some slides. Should I tell me when you want to see them?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Dean. It's just really that one slide that I want to show because it answers this exact question, which I know is a really important one. And so why don't I just remind people first that, all of us here today have done extensive work explaining the problem with virus isolation. And so Tom and I put up a statement that is very brief and gets to the point, and it's written for the average person on our website, the statement on virus isolation. And then if you want to go in much more depth and in historical context, I highly recommend that you read Dr. Lanka's articles that he published in Wissenschaft Plus. I hope I said that right, but you can certainly, Dean has translated a lot of those. So, this is sort of the beginning information here on our website, and then the graduate level material is in terms of Dr. Lanka's writing. But this is, in fact, the most important issue of the whole pandemic to look at. And you can bring up the slide now as I go over why. And I would say that the most important reason why this is the, we go to slide 10, please. Perfect, thank you. So here is the most important reason, number one, because this is the truth, that there is no such thing as a virus that causes disease. And this particular alleged virus, SARS-CoV-2, has not been proven to exist at all. And once we realize that, if we say anything else, we're not telling the truth. And, for me, I think the most important way to freedom, to advance science and knowledge, to achieve health, harmony, and balance in the world is to try to learn the truth and then utilize that truth to bring about those things. And that is paramount in all of our endeavors. Now, if you also understand this, then all of these issues, okay, everything we're facing in terms of the medical science, like tests, mortality, vaccines, quarantines, lockdowns, and then in terms of other economic policies and, et cetera, these are every single policy, every single test, every single operation, every single article and website data is all based upon the existence of this virus. So if you understand that there is no virus, then you know that all of these things are false. And you don't have to waste time learning about PCR tests, studying mortality statistics. I mean, one of the most diligent people, it took 30 pages to write a paper just explaining mortality data, right? There's no reason to do that because if anyone died, it wasn't from a virus. So it really helps cut through all of the confusing information and data that's out there, and you can understand everything in one instant once you understand this one fact. And it's also much, much easier to understand this issue of the virus because it's simply a yes or no question. Does the virus exist? Yes or no? If it doesn't exist, it can't cause a disease, right? So everything else is for some other reason, and you can understand it immediately through that lens. And then, of course, beyond that, we can never know what is the true cause of any illness or disease if we assume that it's caused by something that it's not. And this is why, even though we have 100 years of extensive funding and research being done in healthcare, we've made hardly any progress. There are no diseases really which can be cured as a result of all of this research. So we're really missing out on having actual true health outcomes. And then, of course, there are a lot of other false narratives and stories that have thrown in here maybe to subvert our efforts to people who understand that there's no serious illness and to distract us and et cetera. For example, the fact that this has been a government engineered virus that has been put out into the world. Now, there's just no evidence whatsoever to support that at all. And you would understand that it's not even possible if there are no viruses that cause disease, because if there are no natural viruses causing disease and passing from person to person, then how could they make one in a laboratory, right? So straightforward, this is, without a doubt, really the only issue that you need to spend time figuring out. And you really only need 1 to 2 hours of thought and consideration and looking at the material carefully to understand it.
Yes, thank you very much to bring it down to this central point and so easy. Thank you very much. That's it. Yeah.
Maybe I can show the viewers also Stefan's work. The balloon and the needle you were talking about is, let's see, this here. here. This is the website that Stefan put up lately, and here is
Does that mean light from darkness?
um, light.
Yeah.
Light, bring light into the darkness. Yes.
Yeah.
And the project is explained here. You can see the cards, the map of Germany with the first inputs already. So here are files uploaded where people bring in their claims that they wrote to the government or to the officials. And so people can learn from other people what they wrote and how to formulate their claims. And this is all about these 7 arguments about the virus isolation. And yesterday, the web designer also put Switzerland on there, Austria, and the northern part of Italy, where they also speak German. So this is,
We need to get the United States on there.
yes.
Yes.
And I wanted to show the viewers also Tom's new project. This is Subscribe Star, where Stefan appeared yesterday as well, right?
Yeah.
Maybe, Tom, would you like to say 2 words on this?
It's just an initiative to gather people who are really wanting to work on this into a kind of in the first an online community, and then hopefully they actually meet each other and actually form a real community of people who are committed to understanding the truth and understanding that there is a joyful way to live out there. And we don't have to live in the way that some people want us to live.
Thank you. Okay, then let's go to the next part, which is called the history of biology. I wanted to ask you to elaborate your thoughts on cell theory, genetics, and yes, of course, the history of biology. Maybe this time, Andy, you could start.
Sure. Well, actually, it's perfect that I start because really I'm only capable of giving an introduction on this topic. Dr. Cowan and Lanka have spent much more time diving into this material, I think, and for a longer than I have. But what I want to say really to help introduce the subject is what we see happening, in the scale of where we start to investigate things is, at first, we realize that some superficial things are kind of upside down, like the meaning of germ, that really means a new life, or like when we germinate seeds or have germ cells that make babies. And then the meaning was turned upside down to mean an agent of disease and death, right? So we see that happening. And then we look deeper and we see that actually the bacteria that were said to cause disease actually keep us alive and support our health. And what happens is that each time you take a step deeper and deeper into the scientific paradigms that we've grown up in and we've been told are the truth, we actually see the same pattern over, that there's an inversion, a turning upside down of the real truth into something that is not really true. And so we're going to see this as we look deeper at every level of the biological sciences. So for example, if we just look at the whole theory about a cell, what is a cell, right? The single smallest unit of life, that we think of our bodies as being made up of trillions of cells. We know, like we think of bacteria and fungi and amoebas as single-celled organisms. And we have this model of what's inside the cell, that there's a nucleus with a membrane and pores, and there are various what they call organelles, right, which are structures inside the cell that have different roles. Like some of them are supposed to make proteins or digest waste products or store things or move receptors to the cell surface. And then receptors is another big thing that they say every membrane is filled with receptors, and that's how it interacts with every other thing. And then we also know that each cell is like a battery, that it has a membrane potential. We can measure a certain amount of volts, and it needs to keep that, otherwise it can't function, right? So there are all these aspects that we learn, but when we start examining each and every one of those, we find that actually many of them are not true at all, and we really don't know the true nature. So for example, some of the organelles that we have accepted that are inside every cell, upon further examination, they're simply artifacts of preparing tissue to be viewed under a powerful microscope. Or, for example, with like the membrane potential or the battery aspect of our cells that I told you about. Well, it turns out that if you do an energy calculation, you'd see that the explanation they have for how that battery is maintained can't possibly occur, because there's not enough energy to make it happen, right? So there's got to be other explanations for these things. And the deeper we look, the more we see this, and we can get down even to levels of quantum physics, right? And experiments that like the double slit experiment that show the observer effect, which is completely unaccounted for in materialist science. And I think if you drill down to the base level, it's really the philosophy of materialism and reductionism that have become the pervasive underlying philosophy of modern biological science and physical sciences. And everything that is built upon that foundation does not account for the consciousness that we experience, and therefore it can't provide an explanation for the true reality, because it ignores that most important aspect. So all of the biological sciences that are built on that are going to also be false in their entirety. And there may be little aspects that have truth to it, but the overall understanding is completely inverted.
Stefan, would you follow up here?
Well, I want to add that in the cell theory, we see all the misconceptions of our history, right? And there was a setting, as I told, 2,500 years ago in our culture, in the Greek culture, that they built a theory of life without fields, without consciousness, without God. So they had to claim that matter is building up life without any outside help, only by the materialistic interaction of matter, right? And therefore, they had to conclude that there must be a building map, there must be a plan for the building, for the cell, and for the organism originating out of a cell, and for its function. So they had to invent the idea of a genetic material, and that a disease is a damage inside this genetic material, in this map to build us, to maintain us, and to direct the hundreds and thousands of different biochemical interactions. So this is a force, this is the result of a wrong setting in our culture. And the concrete wrong setting had been done in the year 1858 by Rudolf Virchow. And he came up out of the nothing with the notion that life comes out of single cells by cell division, violating everything which we knew already on tissues, that tissues do exist, they live, they separate, they enroll themselves. This is called embryology, right? He suppressed this in order to become famous, and in order to have a really, he had a motivation. It seems low motivation, but for him it was essential because he had a lot of debts from his father and he had to become famous, and was it. And he came with the new idea that the toxin of life is causing toxins and it is produced by every single cell. So he came out with the claim that all life comes out of a cell and all disease comes out of the cell, the toxin of disease. And here we go. And if we are not able to question this, or the one who is not able to question this, it's not awarded with a deeper understanding of life, and he's not awarded with the gift of security, to feel secure in your own body and to feel secure inside the creation. Because then you are forced to believe in the good and in the bad, in damages or in a hijacking of your cells by viruses, so genetic material, which is dangerous, you know. And this is it. I mean, go into the history, then you see it, how it's focused in the year 1858 in the cell theory, which equals the atom theory of life. And Virchow, in fact, came across this information, and he was using this information to become public and to become an important figure, which he came because he was the one who did the fusion of science and medicine with the state. That was his goal. And this was in the same moment the end of science, the end of free science. Because when something is established, this was already elaborated by Ivan Illich in his book, The Nemesis of Medicine, as soon as you are going to establish an issue into academy, into university, then it's not able that it's changed and it's going to be taught for forever. And so the universal genius, Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy, came already across, or he wrote in 1956, that they do the wrong research on cancer based on the wrong ideas of Pasteur, so the infectious theory, and would it be rabies? And this was already seen in 56, that both the infectious theory and the theory of cancer, it's falsified, it's wrong, but it's still lasting. And so, I mean, the question of isolation, it's become the central question. If we finally, as a humankind, are able to reach a higher step of understanding and behavior, leaving the good, bad, and wars and all these things behind us, and getting back to the source of life, which is eventually God and the Word as written in the Bible. I mean, if you have this overview about how life works, how disease works, how healing works, you have a proof that these fields, name it God or name it spirit, are working, in fact. And this is the possibility, what we have now, to really leave these negative aspects of history, which of course brought ourselves industry, the internet, you know. Most likely without accumulation of power, we would not be able to speak, you know, across continents, right? And inform the whole population in one moment, you know, at least the ones who are seeking this information. So this is the positive aspect behind all of this, that we are finally able to reach a better basis, a higher understanding of life, respect in front of life, yeah, that life still and is going to be a secret which we can approach if we stay decent, and if we are asking the right questions to life, we'll get the answers. And this is it. This is, you are, everybody who is watching this or reading this, she is rewarded by a deeper understanding of life, by deeper security, and by joy, to realize, to be part of a great thing which with sense.
Thank you. Tom.
So when I think about the history of this, and I also think about my own history, because I've been at this for almost 40 years, and in some ways, all that time, one step after another, essentially debunking science. So I wrote a book about the heart doesn't pump the blood, that the blood has an autonomous movement of its own. And cancer is not a genetic disease, it's based in the water. And when I think about the history of this, there's two things that come to mind. And I unfortunately don't know the name of the painting, but I think it was an Italian painting, let's say sometime in the 1700s. It's a famous painting, and maybe somebody can tell me more which painting it actually is. It was a painting of an autopsy. And I remember seeing that when I was in my early 20s and thinking to myself, why would somebody paint an autopsy? You know, there was a bunch of doctors doing an autopsy, obviously on a dead person. Like, why was that of interest? Of course, humans have always been doing autopsies on people who died. So what was the big deal? And the other historical, I think, quote or moment was one of my heroes is Goethe. And Goethe, I don't think this is a quote, but sort of a paraphrase. He said, the problem with Western science is we want to understand frogs, right? We want to understand what a frog is made of and how frogs live. And we want to help frogs, and we want to just have an understanding connection with frogs. So the first thing we do is we kill the frog. And then we dissect the frog and see what the frog is made of. And I can remember thinking to myself, well, it certainly didn't help that frog because that frog is dead. And it gets into the question. It turns out they never did autopsies before 16 or 1700 for a very simple reason, which is once the person was dead, there's nothing to learn about the life of a human being. Because now you're studying simply matter. And since that's actually the mostly irrelevant part of a human being, then there's no reason to do an autopsy. And the same thing is if you kill the frog, there's actually nothing more to understand about how frogs live or the life of a frog. And now we've killed, I don't know, millions of frogs. And the only upshot of that is frogs are almost extinct. So it didn't actually help the frog. It didn't help the environment that the frogs live in. And all we have is an erroneous understanding of what a frog or a human being is made of now after millions of dead frogs and autopsies. And then I went on to just trying to observe and see if what I was observing made sense with the theories. So a very simple one was, we have a theory about how nerves work, which is that there's basically an influx and an efflux of calcium and magnesium, and then the polarization travels down the nerve, and then it comes to a synapse, and then a neurotransmitter is released, and then it hooks up with the postsynaptic junction, and then the next calcium goes down the next nerve, and then the next synapse. And I thought to myself, and actually did some research and found that it takes 0.05 seconds, they said, to cross the synapse. And so if you add up all the synapses between hearing something and moving your finger, it should take about 4 seconds before you say, wiggle your finger, and then you wiggle your finger. And so I actually, all my patients, I would say, hold up your finger, and I'm going to say a word, right or left. And I would say right, and they would say about, it happened instantaneously. And I thought, this can't possibly be the truth, that there's this polarization and synapses and chemicals and all this stuff. So I just kept going from one thing to another. And then actually with the help of Stefan, telling me to read Harold Hillman, what I found is that the only thing you can actually show is in a living animal or living organism is basically a very thin membrane, which probably is fat soluble. And then if you read Gilbert Ling, who I've been reading for decades now, it's organized water with a bunch of like minerals and lipids and proteins. There's a mitochondria and a nucleus, and that's it. There's nothing else in there. And so the way it works is so much different than what we're told in history of biology and medical school. And like Stefan said, these things that we believe in are, and Andy, are all artifacts of the way we process dead tissue. The bottom line here is at some point, we're going to have to study life and consciousness and spirit, because that is all we're talking about here is the interaction of life and spirit and energy with water, with a few things dissolved in it, to create de novo all the stuff that a human being is made out of. And once we get that, then we'll start asking the questions, well, how is the water made? And how do you make the best water? And what kind of energy should we be exposed to? Like the sun or Wi-Fi or hatred or lies or the truth and beauty and Bach, and all these things organize us into a living organism. And if we ever get that, we can create a whole different world that I think will start working for everybody.
Did you mean Michelangelo when you were talking about the painting?
It could be. Like I say, I don't know who did the painting, but yes, there it is. Right. Like, what was the big deal? I thought they'd been doing autopsies for 2,500 years.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently not.
Mm-hmm.
The last part, you already transitioned the whole discussion onto this. We come into the spiritual part of our discussion. I put the title Dare to Think. It's about the spirit and the mind. Stefan said a word can kill, but a word can also heal. And it's all about what you think will materialize. I would like you to talk a little bit about this, the spiritual part now. Andy, would you like to start again?
I would love to. Thank you. And I actually really, this whole experience for me, I would describe really as being a spiritual experience more than anything else, because and for me, you know, my real spiritual pursuit is finding truth, because I view this context of us being, you know, in this material vessel our consciousness is housed in during this experience, you know, as a man on earth, is for the purpose of learning. And so one of my most influential spiritual mentors, Neil Kramer, describes it as classroom earth. And that this is really a challenge, right? That we have this opportunity to learn and grow by figuring out what is really the true nature of our spirit and consciousness, you know, as part of this experience. And this involves, of course, a lot of misdirection. And much of that is in the form of language, because, you know, while we grow up using language, it's not really our innate way of communicating, right? It has to be acquired over our lifetime. And we have to be exposed actually to language in order to be able to be fluent in it, right? As we know from some children that grew up without language past a critical point, that they no longer have that ability. So there's something about our nature as humans that is separate from language. And I think this is heavily involved in our thinking, that when we use words, we really limit ideas. Because we're putting things into a narrow category that already has a pre-populated information about it or a predefined meaning. Like, for example, when a child is, outside and viewing things for the first time, you see this sense of amazement, right? And I've witnessed a child seeing an airplane before they knew what airplanes were, and they look up in the sky in complete wonder and see this huge flying thing, right? And they couldn't have no preconceived notion of what that is, other than it is, an amazing thing to behold. And once we, call that, oh, that's just an airplane, right? An adult would say, it completely zaps that child out of a stage of, wondrousness and creativity and imagination, and into a world of, limits and boundaries. Oh, that's just something that we use to go to business meetings or vacations, right? Not like, oh my gosh, something that big can just move through the air. What are the possibilities? Could we do that? Are we supposed to do that? All these kind of limitless, boundless ways that we really, as our natural way to conceive the world, are pigeonholed by the use of language. And this is played out, further in our institutions and organizations, that we get, narrower and narrower fields of focus, such that we are essentially in blind alleys and we can never see the whole picture. It puts limits upon us. And that's why the state of virology is the way it is, because no one from the outside is questioning it. And they are just have an incestuous viewpoint that feeds upon itself, and the fraud and lies of the science just become perpetuated and believed, through that dogmatic parochialism. And if we, look further at language, the meaning of individual words is changed, and it's often changed in order to support the viewpoint of some oppressive or controlling or imperialist force. I mean, even if we take the word racism, for example, and I hope what I say now is not too controversial, but if you go back to like the 1828 American Heritage Dictionary, for example, and look up the word racism, what you'll find is the definition is taking pride in one's race or nationality. So, a modern day example of that would be the St. Patrick's Day Parade, which we just recently had, or maybe it was canceled this year, but that is taking pride in your identity as an Irishman, right? And we don't see any problem in that, of course. But when you had the, World War II coming around, and you had this genocide narrative and such come about, the definition of racism was then changed to mean essentially, having hatred or oppression towards someone's race, right? The exact opposite thing. Now, I wonder which came first, the actual, policies of the Holocaust or the change in the definition of racism, because this language can have such a big influence on people. And we see this, of course, with, the word virus meaning poison, with the inversion of the word germ, right, from new life to agent of death. And we see that this is a very much a way of limiting our thought and possibly manipulating us into certain beliefs or accepting, certain conditions of our life. So it's very important to be able to be aware of this, to study it and transcend, so that we can, have a more natural appreciation and understanding of the truth of the natural world and our true role in it.
Thank you so much. I noticed when you brought this example of the plane that your voice lowered, and you said, "Oh, it's just a plane." And this is, I think, it's also a spiritual thing that we have in our voice to bring about to the other people the way we speak, the way we use our voice. Because my dog, for example, he has that with planes and with helicopters too. Just today on the walk, we saw a helicopter, and my dog Hector, the fawn Great Dane, the one that Bruce Lee had as well, he looks up at the helicopter and is just like a child. What's that? But he cannot say anything there, of course.
Yes, well, dogs, are probably purer than we are. They're not corrupted by this, influences of language. Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. This was really, really spiritual and insightful. Yes.
Maybe I can go next after that. That's okay, because I didn't have anything planned to say, but now that I hear Andy, I'm going to follow up with that, because I did write one other book which never got published, which was called How to Raise a Healthy Child in a Toxic World. And obviously there's a lot you could say about that, and I need to be careful about how I say this maybe, but my basic point was never teach a child anything. That was the basic point of the book, and that's maybe why nobody wanted to publish it, because it was just so controversial. But how I arrived at that was, again, most of it for me is my own experience with my children and then my grandchildren, and then lots of children I interact with in various ways. But if we believe the sort of modern physics conception of the world, which I'm not sure if I believe 100%, but let's say for a minute that the things, the stuff in the world exists either as a particle or a wave. And then they tell us that the thing that determines whether it's a particle or a wave is whether somebody looks at it. In other words, the consciousness of the person determines whether it's a particle or a wave. Now, a particle doesn't actually have any substance to it, because if you think about it, it's a nucleus, and then somewhere in the next county, there's the electrons, if it was to scale. So it's 99.99% space. And how that makes a foot is, beyond me, I think. But a wave is even less of a particle than that. And then I ended up with the conception that essentially our health is dependent on whether you see yourself as a particle or a wave. If your conception of yourself in the world is that I'm a wave, which is basically consciousness and spirit, or whatever word you want to use, you will be healthy and free and alive. And the more you see yourself as a substantial particle, which is an illusion because it's not actually made of anything in particular, that 99+% of it is space, then you get sick and you start believing in viruses and genomes and all the rest of the stuff that we believe in. And so then I went from there. So how do human beings end up seeing the world as particles? And I just want to be careful here that I think the evolution of humanity, we have to go through a kind of particle consciousness phase, and including an individual human and humanity in general. Like Stefan said, that's how we ended up being able to build bridges in the internet. So it's not like there's nothing useful. And even Andy's comment about there's something useful about doing autopsies at times as well. But at the end of the day, you have to come back to be healthy and alive to see to this wave consciousness. And I ended up thinking that the way that a child develops particle consciousness is we teach them to do that. They, like, I don't think a 6-month-old child sees things separately like we do. Like, that's a flower and that's the soil and that's a tree, and they're all individual, distinct entities. But they do when we say, you see that, that's a flower. You see that, that's the dirt. You see that, that's a tree. And we're essentially training them to see this atomized view of the world, and then they get sick because that's a toxic way. It's not only toxic, it's incorrect. So I decided, and partly from watching children, if you watch children interact, they don't teach each other anything. In fact, if a child tries to teach another child, they're immediately ostracized as some sort of bully and, you know, like domineering person that they don't want to be around. So I just decided I'm not going to teach them any. If they ask me something, I'll say. And it was amazing how harmonious it all was. It was like we were just playing garden. And nobody was trying to teach anybody anything. And it's the most amazing experience of life. You don't say it's an airplane. It's just amazing. Like, look at what the world is made of. And anyways, I don't even remember what the question was, but that's how I see it. And I think what we're talking about is training ourselves to see the world as a wave or a consciousness or a spirit. And it absolutely has to do with words, because words is how we name things, often incorrectly.
You were right on point. I mean, this is what it's all about the spirit and the mind. And just when you said this or brought this example from the airplane again, I was just thinking back today on my walk when my dog looked up, what's that? I started wondering too, how in God's name can this heavy thing fly or be up there? I didn't know. It's just
yeah. And it, you know, the best explanations for how things work are in fairy tales. They have exact descriptions. You know, how does it work? I mean, you know, not airplanes, because they didn't talk about that, but, you know, how does the world get sick? Because the materialistic witch put a spell on the world. That's the Sleeping Beauty story. And how does the world heal? When the prince decides they're not afraid. Then the toxic thorns fall down, and immediately the whole world is healed. And their use of words is this imaginative world that's without sort of this naming consciousness that we have decided that is the only way to be.
all right, Stefan.
Yeah, I mean, doing all this work or dedication through all the last years, I was and still I am rewarded by a deep insight, by more and more a feeling of security. And years ago, it came to my mind that deeper questions on life and the meaning of life and on God, that probably we only get it when humankind reaches a level of harmony, right? And then automatically on this level, we are rewarded by deeper insights, you know. And to put it to a short a point, when a word can kill and a word can heal, then it's sure that a word is most likely or is the cause of what we are and probably of everything. I mean, this is logic, right? If a word has such an impact that it can definitely kill you, not only break down your heart into a bubble, right? The broken heart syndrome. But when a word can heal, so the consequence out of these given facts, which are definitely facts for me, I experienced on my own, then I can conclude that the word is the cause of our life as we experience it. And I mean, probably the most important sentence from my teachers or people I run into, and I'm grateful, is the one of Rudolf Zahner from this village here. And he told me that life is always going to be a secret. But if you stay honest, decent, and if you ask the right question, you are approaching more and more. And this is, I think, my function. This is what we are doing, in fact. And this is going to have an impact on everybody. This is what I'm sure about it. And there is a saying, Dean, you are good in this, you know, if a truth or if something becomes a truth at the moment, nothing can stop this to work out and to materialize. There's a saying in German, I'm not able to translate it now into English, but Dean for sure is going to find it and put it at the end of the video. And so I want to express my gratefulness for this, what I have learned, and for every challenge I experienced, and for every suffering, because I came out stronger and I become out hopefully wiser, and hopefully the next time with a better English as well. Thank you.
So I see time's up. You see the sun sets. Andy had to leave. He has an appointment. But I would like to, for the last, just read you one of the viewers' comments on the last Freedom Talk 1, so you know what people think about it. Just a quick one. There's one viewer comment that I wrote down here. It says, Cowan, Kaufmann, and Lanka. Yeah, all my heroes together at last. Thank you. And that's 3 times. I'll hope these discussions are only the beginning. Please keep together, you guys. The world needs you all to clarify the true reality, not the miseducation we have all been constantly fed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This.
All right. So thank you for participating again, and wish you all.
Okay. Till next time.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.